Welcome to this event sponsored by the United Lodge of Theosophists in San Diego, part of their Aquarian series. My name is Steve Levy. I am an associate of the United Lodge of Theosophists in Philadelphia. I will be the chairperson for this evening's subject, which is Renunciation and Action. Very interesting title. We usually think of renunciation of action. So renunciation and action certainly touches our curiosity. We're delighted to have with us a associate and a student of Theosophy, Laura Gray, who is from the ULT in London, Ontario, Canada. And she will begin with a presentation of this subject on renunciation and action. And then we're open for questions, answers, and discussion. So, Laura?
Thank you, Steve. Thank you. When we look at this image of Kuan Yin, it is important for us to realize that we are looking at our own possibility, that we're looking at what is possible in our own evolution. She stands as an example to us as to what is possible. Albert Schweitzer said that example isn't the main thing in life. He said it is the only thing. Mm-hmm. And that is important to realize because we, each of us, to a degree, can be an example for others. Through renunciation and through action, we can become an example for others of their potential by degree, just as Kuan Yin stands as an example to us. No, go back again. To be able to become, we must know our true power, our true self. We are the real mover behind the ideas, behind will. We are the experiencer, Robert Crosby says, the spirit itself. To lift ourselves beyond the doing of right and wrong, to live for all alike, is a renunciation of the highest kind. To feel compassion for all the suffering that is brought to bear on all beings. The highest ideal of renunciation we see in the life of Kuan Yin. It is the path given in the voice of the silence, to live to benefit all beings. From Lucifer magazine, HPB wrote in 1889, real theosophy is altruism, and we cannot repeat it enough, or too often. It is brotherly love, mutual help, unswerving devotion to truth. If humanity will but realize that in this alone can true happiness be found, and never in wealth, possessions of any kind, or any selfish gratification, then the dark clouds will roll away and a new humanity will be born on earth. Then the golden age will be there indeed. And what we see in the background there is actually a rendition of the village that HPB was born in Russia. To realize the greatest renunciation, again, can I ask, does that bar at the top interfere?
No.
Pardon?
It does not.
Oh, good. Thank you. Sorry. To realize the great renunciation, that of Kuan Yin, it is important for us to realize the many ways in which we move through the day letting go. We are in motion all day long. Outwardly, we must get out of our chair and go to do our errands. We must let go of a desire to stay home to go to work. Inwardly, we must let go of our selfish position to accommodate those around us for the greater good. We must renounce old habits as we grow new ones. When we look up the word renunciation in the dictionary, it gives the meaning a formal rejection of something, typically a belief, a claim, or course of action. We could also consider the giving up of a bias or a position. From the Latin, it is to protest against, a refusing or rejecting, no longer having a connection with something. And from the Hindu meaning, it goes deeper, and it is a sacrifice, asceticism itself, which we saw in the writings from Lucifer. Action is to perform, to achieve an aim, or where action is the process of doing something. We all know that we cannot steer a car if it is not moving. So in order to give direction to matter, we have to be moving matter, and this requires action. In the Hindu philosophy, there are 7 kinds of renunciation: to reject, to deny, to disown, to forsake or resign, to repudiate or contradict, abandonment, and the highest, to be absorbed into the universal soul, to lose all sense of separateness, to put down everything, all of it, purification. In the Theosophical Glossary, sannyasi is a Hindu ascetic who has reached the highest mystic knowledge and who has entirely renounced everything terrestrial and worldly. All these degrees of renunciation can be positive or negative, selfish or unselfish. To truly renounce is an inner change that must take place, and that becomes visible through our actions. As we unfold or evolve our day and our life, we do so with an intention that manifests with greater or lesser degree, and all require a kind of renunciation. For example, to resolve any conflict in a relationship, personal, cultural, social, political, etc., requires us to renounce who we think we are, with all our attachments and likes and dislikes and wants and don't wants, and become more of who we truly are as the self. And then from that basis, perform action. To a greater degree, we see renunciation exemplified in the action of 2 friends. Vinoba Bhave and Mahatma Gandhi studied the Bhagavad Gita throughout their life and turned to the Bhagavad Gita for help and balance when needed. Their work is an example of renunciation and action. We can see that in their effort to help humanity is a process that took place over many lifetimes, such as how we build our character, an unseen journey of progressive renunciations to be ready to renounce the personal to the universal when karmic events come before us. We all know of Gandhi, but we may not have heard of Vinoba Bhave. He was the founder of the Bhoodan Yajna for the land gift movement. And he traveled India to convince landowners to give up their land to poor farmers so that they could be of benefit to the villages around India. He was born of a high caste Brahmin family, and he renounced his college studies in 1916 to join Gandhi's ashram. Gandhi's teachings led Bhave to a life of austerity dedicated to improving Indian village life. And he says of Gandhi, "I know nothing which is of greater value than reading the Gita. And yet I have found a living person who follows the philosophy of the Gita in his own life." During a time of intense agitation in 1932, many prisoners were gathered together at the Dula jail. The jail life was marked with uncertainty at that time, and nobody would have thought that these talks that Vinoba Bhave gave while in jail would reach the whole nation throughout all its languages. Vinoba spent 5 years in jail for his resistance to British rule. And while there, he gave talks on the Bhagavad Gita. These talks have been published and are available from the M.K. Gandhi organization. He says, imagine saying this while in jail. Keep smiling in happiness, and also keep smiling in sorrow. They are one and the same. He also wrote, compared to the sun, the earth may appear worthless. It may not be self-luminous, but still I should strive for self-development by staying on the earth, which is my rightful place, so long as I lack the capacity to stand the sun's powerful blaze. Yoga means nothing but the art of translating the principles of life into practice. The word Sankhya means principles or science, while yoga means the art of translating it into practice or action, we could say. The Gita includes both Sankhya and yoga, the science and the art respectively, and has thus achieved completeness and perfection. When science and art unite, the beauty of life blossoms into its fullness. Science by itself remains an abstract level. And one more quote from Vinoba. When the Gita says, let there not be, let there not be any attachment to akarma. And akarma is the refraining from action. The meaning of this extends thus far. That while doing desireless work, one must not have a desire even for the ultimate freedom from that work. That is moksha. For moksha means nothing but freedom from all desires. Why should there be a desire for it? When we renounce the fruit of actions, the art of living attains perfection. In the manifested world of many conflicts that we see around us, There are always right and wrong on both sides. The wise know this, and they know that both sides must renounce their limitations, their definitions of themselves, to raise up to a greater awareness, a common ground. They must renounce the position that they hold now. And we see in the life of Gandhi that he wanted both the British and his fellow people from India, he wanted them both to renounce their definition of themselves, to lift themselves to a more universal position. And he says, the act of renunciation of everything is not a mere physical renunciation, but represents a second or new birth. It is a deliberate act, not done in ignorance, and it is therefore a regeneration. A principle must be realized that we can manifest. We have that example in Kuan Yin. And that will allow us to outgrow or renounce our current position to a degree. We evolve. We leave our low-vaulted past, as the poem The Nautilus puts it so well. It takes the laws of karma and reincarnation to build our tendencies or skandhas, to be ready to take up a task. And so all the effort we make now is where we can, that will help us in the example of the work of Vinoba and Mahatma Gandhi, that we are in the process of getting ready for a great work, whether we know it or not. We're building up our skandhas, we're building up our tendencies, we're building up our character through renunciation and action. For renunciation is very much action itself, and we must act, or we could say that we are compelled to act. And in so doing, we create the effects or karma, which then experienced furthers our opportunity to learn, to grow, and evolve. Why would we even consider stopping this process? We are not to give up action, but to purify our action and make it more universal. Some feel that to give up action altogether will stop karmic effects and thereby free us from earthly existence. It might work for a while, if indeed a purity has been achieved. And that will allow us to leave behind all earthly awareness. But when a new cycle, a great cycle begins, we will once more be compelled to act, and we will have lost an opportunity of the previous cycle to learn and evolve. There is no such thing as a permanent state of being. There is truly no staying place in this unfolding of life, law, and being. We can see renunciation and action are two sides of one thing, just as spirit and matter are two aspects of the absolute. And this is what makes evolution possible. We have here, for anyone that's new to Theosophy tonight, we have here the devotional books that have been given to us from beings, great teachers who have traveled this way before us and left behind the light and knowledge of their wisdom gained. And these books are available at all lodges. They're available online and for purchase or loan or for free in a PDF format. So we invite everyone to consider these books, The Voice of the Silence, the Bhagavad Gita, Dhammapada, and Light on the Path. They all speak of renunciation. Today we'll consider a few passages from the Bhagavad Gita by William Q. Judge. Do we have any volunteers that would like to, and I can't see you, so you'll just have to step in to read. We'll have 3 readings from the Bhagavad Gita before we have our discussion. Do we have any volunteers to read?
I could volunteer.
Thank you.
So just read this one right now. Okay.
Yep.
Action. Even sages have been deluded as to what is action and what inaction. Therefore, I shall explain to thee what is action, by a knowledge of which thou shalt be liberated from evil. One must learn well what is action to be performed, and what is not, and what is not to be, and what is inaction. The path of action is obscure. That man who sees inaction in action and action in inaction is wise among men. He is a true devotee and a perfect performer of all action. Those who have spiritual discrimination call him wise, whose undertakings are all free from desire, for his actions are consumed in the fire of knowledge. He abandoneth the desire to see a reward for his actions, is free, contented, and upon nothing dependeth. And although engaged in action, he really doeth nothing. He is not solicitous of results. With mind and body subdued, and being above enjoyment from objects, doing with the body alone the acts of the body, he does not subject himself to rebirth. He is contented with whatever he receives fortuitously and is free from the influence of the pairs of opposites. Keep going?
Yeah.
Okay. And then Krishna says, and that was from chapter 4. This one's going to be from chapter 5. Renunciation of action and devotion through action are both means of final emancipation. But of these two, devotion through action is better than renunciation. He is considered to be an ascetic, one who has really renounced, who seeks nothing and nothing rejects, being free from the influence of the pairs of opposites, O thou of mighty arms. Without trouble, he is released from the bonds forged by action. Children only, and not the wise, speak of renunciation of action and of right performance of action.
Okay. And then the last one for our consideration today.
This is
The man seeth with clear sight, who seeth that the Sankhya and the Yoga doctrines are identical. But to attain to true renunciation of action without devotion through action is difficult, O thou of mighty arms. While the devotee who is engaged in the right practice of his duties approacheth the Supreme Spirit in no long time. The man of purified heart, having his body fully controlled, his senses restrained, and for whom the only self is the self of all creatures, is not tainted through performing actions. The devotee who knows the divine truth thinketh, I am doing nothing in seeing, hearing, touching, smelling, eating, moving, sleeping, breathing. Even when speaking, letting go or taking, opening or closing his eyes, he saith, the senses and organs move by natural impulse to their appropriate objects. Whoever in acting dedicates his actions to the Supreme Spirit and puts aside all selfish interest in their result is untouched by sin, even as the leaf of the lotus is unaffected by the waters. We can see from this the importance of duty. We wonder, what is our duty? We see the duty of fire is to burn and for water to flow. But man's duty is to shine the light of his higher qualities through the action that we go through every day. We have to shine through patience and calmness, charity, indifference to pleasure and pain, all the paramitas. That is our duty. That is our royal talisman. It is when we are working, when we are playing, when we are with friends or doing errands, we can always keep in mind that this light is what we have to shine through all these natural actions that the body is performing. And that is the yoga. That is the nature. And we all do it to a certain degree. And through doing it, we develop discernment. We develop a higher, purer way of interacting with the life around us. And it is only when we are moving and in action that we can begin that process. Robert Crosby's talk on the renunciation of action versus the one that we did today, Renunciation and Action, is available in a book called The Friendly Philosopher and a collection of letters and talks. And he spells out very clearly as to why to renounce action is impossible, but that we must strive to make our actions universal. We are, after all, eternal pilgrims. And so from that definition, we see that no condition is permanent, not even nirvana. Robert Crosby states that there is not a moment when action ceases, whether that action is through the mind, feeling, or intention, or the body. Even if we are quiet in the mind and the body, our inner sheaths of the soul are in constant motion. When we realize that our ideas that we've accepted need to be changed, or aren't true, or are limiting, we enlarge them or reject them altogether. We renounce them. As in the Nautilus, we move to a broader realization, a truer realization. Who is it then that changes the mind, the feelings and desires? What arouses such change is something that we should consider. The nature of renunciation requires that we know to a degree who we are as the self, the knower, and the perceiver. We can seize the day, or as Mr. Judge says, hit the mark, O friend, which is the highest thought we are at any time capable of. We are what Robert Crosby calls the experiencer. And before we go any further, we should read this that he says from the Renunciation of Action. What will be in the future depends upon those who have the power to act in any state of matter. So here we see action is definitely important. The civilization that now is has been created by ourselves. But behind all true progress, there must be a universal conception of spirit, mind, and action. Let us dismiss any idea of renunciation of action. Act always. We have to act. Every principle of our nature compels us to act. If we fear or fail to act in any given place where the situation calls for action, then we have acted in a wrong way, for we have missed an opportunity. And an error of omission is worse than an error of commission. Act then, but act for and as the self of all creatures. Renounce not action, but selfish interest in every thought and act. We are what Robert Crosby calls the experiencer, and we can come to understand deeper what it means not to see and hear with the eyes and the ears, but to see and hear through them. This one self is the self of all beings, and this brings us back to the beginning. the Kuan Yin Pledge. Never will I seek nor receive private individual salvation. Never will I enter into final peace alone, but forever and everywhere will I live and strive for the redemption of every creature throughout the world from the bonds of conditioned existence. So we look forward to comments and questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. In considering our subject this evening, we thought we might remind ourselves that in the 6th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, Arjuna observes that the control of the mind, being that it's so easily agitated and restless and turbulent, seems to be as difficult as controlling the wind. And Arjuna agrees with him and says that it is difficult, but that it can be obtained by the practice of equanimity, absence of desire. And yet, it would seem that these practices in themselves are very difficult. So before we get into that, we see that we do have a hand from Judy. You have a question?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Levy. And thank you, Laura, for a wonderful presentation on the Gita, and Robert Crosby on renunciation of action. I think the most paradoxical statement is that he who sees action and inaction and inaction and action is wise indeed. He is my true devotee and the perfect performer of all action. Now, perhaps some of you would give me a better idea of what this means. I think in one sense it means that if we're doing nothing, like we're sitting in meditation, sitting quietly doing nothing, we are acting, but it depends on whether we're meditating so that we can become a great spiritual being or meditating for the good of humanity. The same thing as when we are acting toward result. Are we acting for our personal selves, or are we acting for the good of the whole? Like if I was a teacher, I tried to teach so that my students would learn, not so that they would vote me to be distinguished teacher. So I wonder what these words mean to you. That's briefly what they mean to me, but they're very difficult and paradoxical, I think.
And we think that points to one of the main difficulties of putting this into practice is understanding the nature of action. It is said that it eludes even the understanding of the wise person. So that'll be one of our goals today, to try to get a handle on the nature of action. Can you think of any other difficulties that might stand in the way of pursuing this renunciation while engaged in action?
I think that maybe this difficulty of understanding action and inaction has to do with the position that the realization of who we are. That so oftentimes we are attached to the doing of the eating and the sleeping and the waking and the doing the errands, that we are attached to those things and we are absorbed in them. And we forget that we have this other work to do, which is to shine the paramitas or the virtues through the action of our physical form and in the course of a day. Could that have something to do with it?
Well, we think that is a very definite difficulty, understanding how can we free our minds from desire in order to renounce. So that's a second difficulty we want to try to explore. Any other thoughts that come to mind why this might be a difficult path?
David's
Yes,
got,
David, please.
Oh, well, I was thinking the idea of righteous anger. Some people, an anger wells up within them, which tends to make them act, and they see, say, injustice in the world. So they're not really necessarily acting calmly, but they're acting because to help others.
Yes, righteous anger, certainly.
Right. Yeah. How do we, how do we deal with that idea of it? We usually think anger isn't a great quality in some ways.
Anger, of course, and a number of the other emotions too.
Right. But they are an energy that will send us forward sometimes, and they're not just for ourselves. Like the idea of righteous anger. I'll just leave it at that.
So as Laura represented there are various different kinds of understanding of renunciation, and sannyasi is the highest. And when we, as David points out, when we observe ourselves and others, we look at these high states, and what hope is there for us? How can we practically begin this path when there seems to be so many obstacles in our way, even as we are now? How do we get above these tendencies in ourselves? So we know that as difficult as it is, it's very important that we get a handle on it, because we share a common goal of making ourselves better able and more fit to help and teach others to carry on the work of the movement and the cause of humanity. And how can we do that if we've not achieved some kind of renunciation of action, of equanimity? So it is important. We might say that's an overarching goal of our discussion today, to get an understanding of the nature and scope of action, to understand how we can free our minds from the desires, so to speak, and what is a path that we can begin that gives us some hope and inspiration, that we can fulfill this task in trying to make ourselves better able to help and teach others. And so when we begin to think about action, the nature and scope of action, we are really looking first into the realm of philosophy. And we are told that theosophy is a synthesis of philosophy, science, and religion. So we should be able to take those aspects of the philosophy or theosophy and answer the questions. But aside from that, we also have our own experience and observations by which we can check, test, and verify the teachings. And so when we come to the point of view of philosophy, we are looking at first principles, the essential nature of something. And when Plato used this like Socratic method, he was trying to get people to think even about the very basic ideas, what they were. And so let's just begin there, because it's very difficult to understand action. So let's start with the simple question: what is action? What is action?
Could we say it's a movement toward result?
Okay.
That could
Well,
be part of it.
it is something that is done, and true enough, we can do things in various different ways, and we know that it's taken place. The essential quality of action, as Judy pointed out, is there's a motion. There's a motion, either a change of place or a change of state.
It's interesting to note that we can't see the source of that motion, the cause of it. When does that motion begin? It begins inside with the will, with the motive, with the intention. These things are all not seen. And they are the cause of whatever effect or whatever action is taken.
Well, in a sense, what you're pointing out is that there can be action on different planes, which expresses itself in movement. And then if we go further, how do we know that a movement has occurred? Well, there's a change. Mm-hmm. So we can draw from conclusions from our own idea and own experience that wherever there is action, there is motion and there is change. And do we know of any change, as Laura suggested there, that does not have some force, either exerted on it externally or within itself, that compels it to act, to move, and to change? And we cannot think of any, and science confirms this as well. So we can conclude that where there is action, there is motion, there is change, there is also force. So they're universal. That's the nature of action. Wherever it is occurring, that's its nature. But then we want to we have to go a little bit deeper and say, well, what's the scope of this action? And since we already discerned that it, now we see a hand going up. Is that Jonathan?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
I was going to throw in the mix that it seems like in the third chapter of the Gita, action is equated with sacrifice, and that must be part of the mixture here.
Yes, and sacrifice is not. We can say it's a giving up of something, but it is also an act of making something sacred. It's a positive as well as a negative quality there. But it is an action in itself on another plane. And we think some of the ideas presented by Laura pointed to that. So we ask ourselves, action is everywhere. It's observed everywhere. Does action, motion, change ever cease? In other words, if an action, or if something appears to cease to act, an object, a being appears to cease to act or change, has motion, action, change itself ceased to exist? What do you think about that? Even if an object, yes, please, Monica.
Thank you. The thing that comes to mind is that this idea in I believe, the first fundamental that talks about the great breath. Maybe it's this great breath. There's, as long as there is manifestation, if I understand it correctly, there's action. And so that does not necessarily mean that the action that is taking place is something that is happening at the level where we can perceive it. So because we're not able to cognize some action does not mean that action is not taking place. But it would seem to me that this chain of perception, say from ambition for the sake of self in action, to action for the sake of others, to an action that is totally disassociated from the personal self, to the idea of the all-inclusive self being the only actor, is a process that we can engage in more fully as we make a choice of engaging in selfless service, however that idea flowers inside of us, what we think it may mean. It is at least a beginning of the journey toward the identity as the self of all, as Mr. Judge says, acting for and as the self of all. So just a thought.
Well, as Monica is pointing out there, wherever there is manifestation, there is action, even if we don't see it. And the reason that is because wherever there is manifestation, there is differentiation. We can think of no object that is not made up of parts or particles that we can't see. Even physical objects are made up of molecules and atoms and subparticles, and the human body, we know, even the physical human body has various parts of it. We don't see the way our digestive system works or our heart circulates or the operations of our cells. We know it takes place. And even when we sleep and we're told when the body dies, there's still action there. And of course, a student of theosophy understands that we act in our mind, we act in our desires, we act in our spiritual, moral nature. So action may appear to cease to exist on one plane, but it does not really cease to exist on other planes. It's continuous. So we understand now that action, motion, change, force are not only universal, but they're eternal and ceaseless. Isn't that interesting? That manifested action in the manifested universe has the same qualities or reflects the same qualities as the motion within that absolute nature. Because the absolute nature is motion and it is change. There's that great breath that comes forth and returns. And the coming forth of that great breath, the force of spirit is omnipotent, brings forth all of manifested universe. So we have that basic theosophical principle that behind all the manifestation of the universe, there is that underlying ceaselessness of motion, change, force. They're all aspects of that one reality. And so everything that comes forth in the universe operates under the same laws of action. They all come from the same source. So when we try to examine the laws of action or motion, we're really dealing with science, are we not? And it's not surprising that Krishna refers to it as the science of the Supreme Spirit, because we're looking how those laws, those eternal laws in the Supreme Spirit manifest throughout nature. So science then is an exploration of laws. So let's look at that. What are these laws of action? Well, HPB tells us that the actions of the molecules and the cells, atomic and molecular motion is the lowest and most material objective manifestation of universal motion. That means that whatever motion we see on the most physical plane that we can understand is a reflection of the same laws of motion that occur everywhere. So we can use them as a model to understand our own mental action and what is action and what is inaction, as the initial question was. So we understand then that there's only three kinds of action in the physical world. There's rotational action, where something revolves or rotates around an axis. There's vibrational action, where something moves back and forth from a mean point, up and down, you might say. And then there's translational action, where something is moving from one point to another along an axis. There's only those three kinds of action. And what's interesting about that law of action, all motion and action is relative to a point or a basis that doesn't move. An interesting insight. So rotational action moves around an axis that doesn't move. Periodic action moves up and down a point that doesn't move. And action along a line moves along a line, but that line itself is stable. So there can be no action unless there is something permanent as its basis. That's a universal law of motion. Yes, David.
Yes. So how would you apply that to the saying in the voice that inaction in the deed of mercy is action in a deadly sin?
Inaction in a deed of mercy is an action in a deadly sin.
Yeah. How would you apply those principles you were just pointing out to the real world, in other words? Yeah.
Right. Well, the action there is the choice, right? It is the choice. It is a mental action. As we'll see, there are actions that relate to the mind. And one of the actions of the mind being is the power to choose. And it can make a choice to act in a merciful way or not to act. But in either case, it's an action that has its effect. And so if the mind chooses to not act in a situation where it should, it is still acting, and the result has a negative consequences. So we'll see that applied more when we just like we study the laws of, we looked at the laws of physical action, those apply to the mind itself. So we might move right into that. How do we see these apply to the human being? Well, we know that there are cycles, and there is periodicity, and there is cause and effect in the human kingdom. We observe this. That's a basic theosophical tenet. But we also know that all this occurs relative to that which does not change. And we know that to be true. What we call that, in the case of the human being, is the self, or the observer, which is the witness, the changeless witness of everything around it which changes. So we had that quote from the Bhagavad Gita: when breathing, when speaking, when sleeping, when talking, when moving, I am not acting, but it is the action of the senses, or it's the action of nature. I am the observer, the changeless point. So this becomes very interesting. Let's see, we have a chat here that came in. We have many words in the English language with the word act in it, and one's acts can, from attachment, one's act can from attachment into karma. One's act can form attachment into karma. Yes. So that it is also the attachment to desire is also an action. So we have here this idea presented to us in theosophy that what is unique to the human kingdom is the inner mind being, the thinker, who is the observer. Now, just as there is physical action, we spoke about of the body. There is mental action of the thinker. And how does the thinker act? Well, the thinker makes choices. Oh, yes, David.
Oh, I was going to say, in one sense, all causation is first on the mental plane. Thought precedes all actions, is all physical actions too, I would think.
And
So, so they're not really separate at all. I mean, excuse me, Laura. You know, one of her main focuses, as an example tonight, was a being like Gandhi. You know, he was on the ground acting in very practical and consequential ways. Yet he was following, it would seem, these high principles of the Gita. It seems like we need to somehow bring these down through the channels of our everyday life to make them meaningful. And sometimes we can stay maybe too much in the abstract side, which can, at least I would say from my own personal experience, something I've thought about a lot is how do we distinguish in ourselves the difference between impersonality on the one hand and apathy on the other. I think these are just things we have to deal with in this subject of action and causation. Yeah.
So as David was pointed out there, you said that the mind acts through thought.
Right.
It does. It's capable of thought. It makes choices, of free will. And remember from our first conclusions, we said wherever there is a force, there is a change, and there's motion, and there's movement. And certainly we can see that our thought has the power to make changes. Now, as thinkers, we know the choices we make. We know the power of our thoughts. We know the will that we exert, the way we use that force of spirit in our self-conscious awareness and the choices we make. But other people don't see that. They just see the results of that inner action. They just see the changes in our body, or the changes in our condition, or the changes in our personality, or the changes in the way we treat each other. In other words, they see the action on the physical plane, on the plane of the personality. But it's the privilege of the thinker to look directly and examine its own action. And it has various modes of action. We know these. The modes of action of the thinker are thought, will, feeling, memory, and imagination. And like every other law of motion, they're subject to cycles, they're subject to the law of cause and effect, and they're subject to periodicity. They come and go. And also, they're all in relations to that observer, that changeless, constant thinker, the self. Same laws, but operating on the mental plane. So
One thing
yes,
in this to prevent apathy, and it's really important, is this idea of the self. When we look at the examples of Gandhi and Vinoba Bhave, what we see is the effects of many lifetimes of renunciation and action, progressive, a changing of the skandhas, a changing of the character that made it possible for them to exhibit such strength in this incarnation. And so it's very important for us to recognize that we can make that example our own. As Emerson said, a poet or a writer or a great teacher is someone who holds an idea for us until we can make it our own. Yes. So we cannot become apathetic in that. The great teachers come again and again to put before us the reality of our own potential. And we have to take hold of it. We can't be apathetic to it. We live in a sea of effects, and behind the sea of effects, there is a cause. And that cause is the self, the spiritual power, that the will, the energy, the strength that is behind every action that Steve was talking about.
So apathy in our mental or emotional nature is equivalent to inertia on the physical plane, and it requires force. And as you said, we shouldn't allow ourselves to be not forceful. But in another way, we never cease to act. The question is, where is our action? And so we have this idea from HPB that there are two kinds of action the mind can engage in its thought, in its creative activity. And she calls one psychic action. And this is when the consciousness, the attachment, is on the fulfillment of the desires and the seeking of those objects which will gratify the desires. But at the same time, the mind is acting that way. It is also under the influence and action and motion of the desires. It's a mutual thing. The desires act on us, and the mind, the thinker, is acting according to those desires. And it is bound in there. But she says there is another kind of action, and that is noetic, or spiritual action. And the key here is that when the mind is free from the influence of desire, it can therefore identify, become aware of, and under the influence of that spiritual will, that spiritual force, that force which is one with that absolute force, motion that brings forth the entire universe. Spiritual will, we might say, is an expression of the creative universal force working through our nature. And so we come under that influence once we free ourselves from desire. And how do we do that? Well, before we go there, we'll take Jonathan, is that your hand again?
Yeah, I think this fits into what's being said here, is that when you said that that the will has to do with overcoming apathy, so that action can start to take place, and it has to do with overcoming inertia. And inertia can be either something that is still, and needs to overcome something in order to get moving, or it can be a certain momentum in a certain direction, and that's kind of like inertia too, just blind momentum. And wouldn't that be corresponding to the psychic action? Whereas what you seem to be pointing to is the spiritual noetic action. And I was wondering if you could speak in terms of overcoming blind inertia through this more noetic action. I think that's what you're talking about anyway. So
Yes, that's the next step that it leads to, doesn't it? Not how do we come, not only that inertia, but the influence of that passion and desire, those qualities of passion and desire, which at times can be rajasic, but they can also be a mixture of the tamasic as well, the inertia you're speaking of. How do we overcome that?
Would there also be a renunciation of the previous blind momentum of our passions? Then it seems like renouncing them would be part of this.
Yes. So here's the essential point, and we've all come to the same conclusion, that if action is ceaseless, it's eternal, it's on all the planes, how can we possibly renounce it? You cannot reject or renounce something that is an aspect of the eternal. Renunciation and action, as Laura pointed out, are two aspects of the same reality. What we can do is cease to act on one plane and choose to act on another. And when we do that, when the mind directs its consciousness away from the desires and the passions, it no longer acts to fulfill those, and it no longer feel those influences. So the natural result of that is the renunciation, is the giving up, the letting go. But at the same time, it has to continue to act on some other plane. Remember, action never ceases. So if it stops to act on the plane of desire, it then has to feel and act on the plane of spirit, which is a natural, for those who reach that state, they describe it in the various devotional books. It's a self-conscious union and oneness with the universality of life that inspires a devotion to act for and as the self of all.
When we renounce one
Action.
condition,
Yes.
when we renounce one condition, we enter into another.
Right.
When
And what
we
happens?
renounce one habit, we move into a new way of acting.
But it can go both ways, can it not?
It
One
can be
choose to
positive or
renounce
negative.
one can choose to renounce the spiritual, but they
Yes.
don't cease to act. They act in the lower.
Yes, it can be positive or negative, selfish or unselfish,
So renunciation and action are going on all the time. It's just
all the time.
where you cease to act, but you continue to act on another plane. Both action and inaction have their place in thee, Krishna said there. So,
Michelle has her hand up.
yes. Oh, yes. Michelle, please go ahead.
Oh, yes. I'm wondering if do you think that if an individual acts from this noetic plane, that by doing so, acting for the self of all, do you think that will help others in order to do the same?
Yes. Yes, they'll become a force. Remember, there is no action where there can be no action change or motion devoid of force. And if there is change in others, it is due to either a force that rises up within them or from external sources. And it may be that we say a word or we do something that either as our own example or something it inspires in them, it impels them to act. It impels the force to make a change, to move in one direction or another and make a change and act in a different way in their own life. But it's the same universal principles applied to different planes of action. So now we get to religion, science, philosophy, and religion. Good place to try to finish up here real quickly. Religion is the forging of bonds. It's devotion to the interests of others. It is practical altruism. And we might say that to achieve all this, HPB has us focusing on the life of altruism. This is theosophy, pure and simple. It brings about renunciation even while we're acting. Action for others at the same time, giving up and renouncing the personal self and its desires. And there seem to be, interestingly enough, 7 commitments. Maybe there's more, but we came up with 7. And these are from, we might say, the philosophy. And she tells us not to live for ourselves, but to live for the world. That's the first commitment. That's the first action that has to take place in the mind, the first decision. And it will have its ripple effect. Take responsibility for the earth because it's a community of beings. Live each day, try to live each day to contribute something to the community of beings that make up this planet. Take responsibility for religious harmony. try to do something each day to improve the relations between people of different religions, different castes, different creeds. Take responsibility or commitment to promulgate spiritual knowledge. Why? Because it gives us the basis for the harmony of religions. It gives us the means by which we can help the community of Earth. And it tells us how we can live for the world and not ourselves. Take responsibility to act for the well-being of others rather than ourselves. And make oneself more fit by study and otherwise. Study is important. Study of ourselves, how we act. What are our actions in our mind? What are the forces? What are the changes we observe in our own minds and our own desires as we choose to act one way or another? And above all, to cultivate. It's a cultivate altruism. Cultivation is an active endeavor. It doesn't come natural. It is a forceful life to live in the higher. So we've tried to cover a subject which we must renounce because the attainment of it is not possible in a short period of time. It's the work of ages. But at least we hope you've got some idea of what is action, what's its scope, how it acts in all of nature, how motion acts in all of nature, how it acts in the mind, and how we can use that knowledge to practically engage in work theosophy for others, and at the same time, renounce our personal desires, renounce our personal selves, so that we act, but at the same time, we are not acting. We are acting on the plane of spirit, but not acting on the plane of personal desire, which is gets us back to your initial question, Judy, was it not? So, if there's no other questions and comments, I guess.
Monica has a beautiful chat, I think.
Okay, Monica.
Tighter.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you. Go ahead.
To Laura and to Steve, such a wonderful presentation. Thank you for your clarity, your wisdom, and your devotion, and the incredible examples. Namaste.
Okay. There's no way to top it. Namaste. Thank you so much, Steve and Laura.
Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you. And thank you for this, giving us the privilege of this wonderful opportunity to work with you and explore these great ideas together. We look forward to doing it again. I know Laura in the future.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank you, Laura.
Jonathan,
Thank you,
do you need to say anything to end the meeting here?
No, just thank you all for coming. I felt like it was Socrates meets Krishna. So wonderful. And what a privilege. Thank you both.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all. Good night.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you.